Welcome to the meeting. Welcome to the Planning and Infrastructure Development Committee meeting. Thank you everybody for being here. We have a exciting agenda put together today, and so let's jump right into it. First, I'd like to call the meeting to order. And now that that's done, I know that we've got some reports to this committee, so let's go ahead and hear some of those.
Thank you, Director Edminster. What I'm going to do on the reports to committee is move through those with just verbal updates because we do have a rather extensive presentation for you today that will also be offered in the full board meeting. You may recall, leading up to that, you may recall that at last month's board meeting, we did a really digging in deeply with the master transit plan on the what, kind of the directional of what we're moving towards. And this meeting is about the how. So it's about the implementation strategies and particularly those financial strategies. So Ms. Cutter, our CFO, has also joined us today so that as we talk about some of those financial strategies, there may be questions that you would best direct to her. On the reports to committee, however, on the planning items update, two key things this month. Obviously, the master transit plan is in full swing on the home stretch leading up to this summer. And then tomorrow, of course, we will all be gathering here at CAT and welcome everyone to join us for the press conference on the SMART grant announcement. That'll be a part of really examining how electric vehicle microtransit can be a part of our community, both reaching deeply into the parts of our community that are not as well served right now by our regular transit service, by reaching deeply into increasing our equity connectivity within the community, and to what's the sort of future of transit as we move beyond COVID from the more traditional just fixed route and paratransit service, but what are those other service lines that can really help us do the best we can for Chatham County and our residents. On the grants update, you have seen in some of our recent reports that we've done very well over the past year on competitive discretionary grants. Continuing also to bring in our normal FTA funding. And then, of course, this most recent SMART grant that we'll be celebrating tomorrow is a $1.2 million, very unusual 100% grant. So no match funding required for it. We are also, however, though, working on state funding and other opportunities that will really enable us to make all of these grant funds count and leverage. The match funds are everything for most grants, and you're going to see that in the presentation that's coming up. And I know Ms. Cutter and I both can tell you that that is a place where we've really got to be mindful moving forward. Whether that is in future opportunities around future T-SPLOST that may come up over the next few years, more state funding, but we've got to really begin to increase our match funding capacity in order to take advantage of all the federal opportunities and in order to just meet our regular obligations. On the communications side, there will be the communications update will be provided under the Executive Governance Committee at the full board meeting. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and move into the presentation. And this is to give you the not the what, but the more of the how side of the update on where we are in the master transit planning effort at this point. Next slide. Oh, and before I do, I'm going to stop for a moment. I want to be sure and introduce our newest planning staff member, scheduler analyst, Ambria Bergsteiner. She joined us on March the 28th. And Ambria is not only getting really into the scheduling analyst that really nuts and bolts with her background in both engineering and in science, so well suited for this position, but in addition to that, we are starting to work with training up on MPO planning and MPO coordination efforts. She's going to be serving on the technical coordinating committee as our representative there, and also just doing some planning 101. So we are delighted to have her expertise and experience and all of her, just brilliance that you're bringing to us. So we appreciate it. Glad to have you here. All right, next slide. So the transit master plan, financial strategies, implementation, and then next steps are going to be the topics for our discussion today. So the master transit plan, and this actually came up in the finance committee earlier, is how all these studies fit together. We actually do have 3 studies going on right now. One started back in 2021 in terms of its procurement and award, which is what they call the COA TDP, Comprehensive Operational Analysis, or Transit Development Plan, or Transit Service Plan. And really what the focus of that one is, and why it's distinctive from the others, is it is really the short term. It's the nuts and bolts. It's about the routes and the stops, the shelters, the timing of the schedules, and it's also a large part of what Ambria is working on now in terms of that scheduler analyst activity that she's digging deeply into. It's really about the operation side of things. The master transit plan takes both the information that comes out of the transit service plan, that shorter range element, and builds it into a more the more strategy side for the short term, as well as that mid and even longer term view of what do we want our transit system to look like in Chatham County and in the region. So takes it's more less about the nuts and bolts and more about the comprehensive strategies and the comprehensive system performance, and how all that route performance fits together into a whole. And then the electrification study, as it's called here, which is the just the plan that we are required to have in order to show how our electric bus fleet expansion and introduction to our system, how that's going to be managed, and what's our plan for continuing to grow that over the coming years. So a really detailed look at that particular part of our fleet. These are coordinated in their technical work. One of the things that we did that we thought was a good idea is, rather than in having these 3 studies just continue to happen sort of independently or singularly, but was to bring the teams together that are working on all those, have them share community and stakeholder engagement. We've been able to leverage the resources more effectively and been able to do more. Example of that is, so the transit service plan has been able to use some of the community and stakeholder engagement activity that's occurring under the master transit plan, so that they can take resources that would have been devoted to that under the transit service plan and use that to do more of the route testing, to do more of the work that we need to do around the temporary service mods that we did, and how we add back, or how we can make some of those permanent, or what are the altercations there. So the notion that we had the resources then there to be able to continue to do that finer level detailed work is really important. And again, that's a part of not only what that consultant team that's working on this is working with, but also what Ambria is working with. But that's a way that we've been able to make the collective resources of those studies go further and do more. Next slide. So the master transit plan investment priorities, transit services, capital investments, and policies and programs. So increasing our service levels, if we've talked about this in previous meetings, if we continue to just serve hourly service, we're not going to grow our system. We've got to be able to provide more service and do it most efficiently and effectively. Introducing microtransit, a new tool in the toolkit, and you'll get to see that tomorrow. It's in effect what looks like more of a paratransit size vehicle. So a smaller vehicle type, so it can move in and out of neighborhoods and around in a particular defined zone, but it operates more like a ride share, a ride hail service would. So it's oftentimes referred to as the Uber and Lyft of transit. But it leverages both technology, and in our case, it's going to also leverage our electric vehicle expansion to be able to provide a more customized and more direct service within zones. We also believe that it will be a measure that will enable us, because we're not going to be just, we're going to use it to help build fixed routes and other parts of our current system. We'll be able to reach more deeply into the community, and by being able to do that with these services, we'll be able to have a higher level of equity impact. So bus rapid transit is also another technology type or transit service type that we're looking at, and that would be a higher capacity bus that also typically moves in some sort of a dedicated, either a dedicated lane or with at least transit signal prioritization, something that gives it a little bit of preferential treatment in how it serves, and it typically serves fewer stops, more of a point A to point B, and also serves a higher capacity. Express bus would be the transit service type that might be able to move people from our area to jobs that are rapidly growing all around us. A good example of that might be the Hyundai facility and getting people to and from those jobs. Again, it's a point A to point B and typically operates tied to either a shift or to an AM PM peak of service. And then bus on shoulder is just a way to expand how we can give buses an opportunity to move more quickly than congested traffic that might be sitting around it. Again, give it that little bit of extra preference. On capital investments, one of the things that you're going to hear later when we consider CAT's overall budget, and you're going to hear this frequently, I believe, from Ms. Cutter, is we know that where does every transit trip really begin? It doesn't begin when they board one of our vehicles. It begins when they're at the stop waiting to engage in their trip. And we know how important those bus stops are, and we want them to be reflective of the kind of service that they're going to get from us and the kind of value that we place on residents and riders. So we want to improve our bus stops so that they are safe and efficient, that are lighted, you have a place to sit. You're not only comfortable, but it feels as though you're in a place where you're respected and there's dignity in the wait. Mobility hubs are ways to be, it's essentially like sort of the, you know how a traffic signal works in a particular corridor, it helps to move the traffic through efficiently and effectively as that traffic builds up and moves. Mobility hubs, in effect, do kind of the same thing with transit service. They help bring the service into particular areas and disperse it back out into the system in ways that make it most efficient and effective. And they can also serve as places where land use, TOD, and those kinds of supportive land use kind of capabilities can also occur. On policies and programs, fare capping, zero fares, we already have our zero fare experience here in with our service with the CAT DOT shuttle service as well as the CAT ferries. But we're looking at, are there some targeted areas where a targeted zero fare expansion might serve very well? An example of that might be with this micro transit demonstration that we're going to be doing through the SMART grant. If one of those micro transit zones is, for example, in the area where the city of Savannah has the tiny village that serves unhomed veterans in our community, that might be a place where we could have microtransit service, and that particular piece of it might operate in a zero fare programming. So lots of things like that to consider. Again, what these are all about is not what we're going to do, but it's about what we might do, and it's about putting all the tools in our toolkit. Job access vouchers, a van pool program, and then of course transit-oriented development is an important part of working with the local community as developments are coming online, especially right now. It's incredible the amount of growth that's occurring all around us. And in some of our partner cities that we're working with, like Garden City as an example, where we're looking at a service expansion, and the kind of development activity that they're permitting can, if it's more oriented towards the transit system serving it, it will operate better, and that we think that development will also be a higher quality development. Next slide. So we are on the master transit plan investment priorities. The team has been working closely with Ms. Cutter and with her team in confirming CAT's funding outlook as a baseline, identifying funding strategies for the highest priority needs. And so we've talked a little bit about some of those and looking at what existing resources do we have available for matching funds, grant funds that can be new resources, and pilot projects that can enable us to test and evaluate before we go wholly into something new and different. We can make sure we know how to do it and where to do it and how that funding strategy can best accommodate that new service. Determine needs and opportunities for new funding, strategies and projects for funding, the what, the timeline is the when, and then those potential funding strategies are the how. And one of the things that you may recall and that we've talked to the full board about in the past is that we've been very careful, very prudent about not only being aggressive about seeking new funding, but being very strategic and targeted. And so we're not going just after every grant. We go after the grants that really make sense for what we're trying to accomplish here. And that we know that we can, that either leverages existing funding, that we know that it puts us in a better position financially, as well as in a better position on operations and service. Excuse me. Next slide. Financial strategies. Next slide. So where's CAT today? Our operating costs are outpacing operating revenues. I know you've seen this information before. We rely heavily on local tax revenues from the special district transit tax to support operations. Those rates have not increased since 2017. The COVID-19 relief funds supplement operations until FY26. Ms. Cutter and the finance team have done such an exceptional job of managing those to our best advantage. The kind of fiscal cliff that many transit systems, and we've heard that discussed across the nation, are facing, we have been so much more both conservative and prudent and mindful in not only how we're managing those funds, but how we're also making sure that we're building that resource of funds that enables us to weather our way through the fiscal cliff much more, I think, effectively, or in a much more healthy way than many of our peers. Passenger fare revenue has decreased to 4%. Again, remember, we've had service reductions, we've had driver shortages, we've had all the same things that many transit systems are dealing with, and that brings that fare box revenue, that fare box recovery down some, although ours has never been tremendously high. Service reductions, lowering costs in the short term, staffing shortages, again, have played a role in that. Next slide. So where's CAT today? We have had an underinvestment in capital needs. Again, this isn't so different from many of our peers across the country, but on the other hand, we have to deal with us and not with everybody else. And so being mindful of the lack of matching funds, building that matching funds capability up, and that some of our assets, whether it's our bus fleet, both paratransit and fixed route, and certainly we have heard a lot around our marine services, the level of, or the state of good repair of all of those, and the useful life of all of those assets, I think got a little bit ahead of us before we began to address how we bring that back into a manageable place. So we're dealing with those kinds of things that have sort of come home to roost, if you will, now. High inflation has increased our capital costs. Some of our prior estimates really weren't as well-rounded perhaps as they needed to be. Additional match has been required. We are being much more specific about our estimates now. And we are also looking at those kinds of things where it's very important when we get grants that we move through with a measured haste, if you will, to getting those things implemented. It's really important to implement quickly and well. And the reason is because the longer you take, the more your costs keep going up. Whether it's the cost of materials or just the time and a natural increase of whether it's inflation, or those kinds of things that we've seen more recently. CAT is targeting and securing capital funds. We've been very successful recently, both with that USDOT SMART grant. And I'll tell you what's really important about it is keep in mind that this is a phase 1 prototype planning concept grant. But what it does is anyone who was selected, I think there were 305, I'm hoping I'm getting these numbers right, 394 applications across the country, 59 were selected. Of that 59, I think there were only maybe 4 to 7 or so that were transit related. So we're in a pretty small group, but you have to have been selected under phase 1 to be eligible for the upcoming phase 2 when they announce those in the next year or so. And those will be the big dollar, big implementation capital funds. So that again will be, we've now leveraged CAT into a leg up position there. On the Georgia Transit Trust Fund, we were very fortunate that the leadership at Georgia DOT took the position this year that, that those Georgia Transit Trust funds, which are those ride-hail fees that are collected across the state, that the distribution of those across the state needed to be undertaken with a formula-style funding approach. That has been done, but in addition to that, there were still other funds that you can compete for on a line item basis. And we have a pending application now under the line item funding, and then also an application that I believe Ms. Cutter is going in this week. Yeah, for the formula funding. So we've got both of those things in play under that particular funding opportunity, which is a new funding source for us. Federal grants require matching funds. How many times have we said that during this presentation? So that is why we also think that T-Splost and some of these other funding strategies that you're going to see are so important so that we can continue to advance and move forward. Next slide. So where's the transit industry today? We're experiencing an industry-wide problem, both in kind of what is transit. It's not just the fiscal cliffs and so forth, but it's also in a re-gauging of what is public transit going to be moving into the future. And does it need to reimagine its market and reimagine itself in terms of how it's going to meet the demands out there and continue to be the great part that we know it is of communities. But again, that fiscal cliff looms, and you've got the COVID relief funds, ridership decreases, all those problematic things that are sort of feeding into it from the financial side. Next slide. How can CAT strategically shape its new normal? Using this master transit plan to build back service to what a new normal is, with a real keen emphasis on equity, making sure that we're serving those in the community who need us the most, while we are also growing that ridership base. So that we really do have a transit system that serves everyone, and we do that by improving service quality for all. Set aside a portion of our annual special district transit tax revenue to fund critical short-term needs, using the one-time COVID-19 relief funds to strategically support that transition that will come out of the description of our vision in the master transit plan. Using new capital funds to match and strategically compete for federal grants that are still coming forward during the bipartisan infrastructure law, this extraordinary period of funding that we haven't seen in decades. Proactively pursue additional local and state funding opportunities, and use funds and success in the field to make the business case for that mid to long-term increase in dedicated annual funding that's really necessary for transit systems to be able to operate in a healthy, reliable way. Next slide. Lower our operating budget targets, again, better aligning with actual service and our staffing capabilities, but still allowing for some new service and new service models like microtransit. Next slide. Set aside local tax revenues to fund critical short-term needs. Again, we've gone through some of this already. We're looking at how we fund a new operator recruitment CDL training program, how we address those state of good repair issues. We talked about that earlier. We've got to make investments in our rolling stock and in our capital in order for it to live its longest and best life, making the service available in our community. Support new passenger facilities and amenities. Again, we talked about that earlier. And then identify capital investments that lower operating costs and leverage federal funds. Ms. Cutter, I'm going to stop here and see if there was anything about this particular slide or any of its observations or the graph that's up there that you wanted to comment on.
I really think it's a good reflection of the goals with the building of partnerships and bringing new dollars to help sustain CAT and with efficient and diverse transit programs. We should see some reduction in operating budget complemented by revenues to support operating.
Thank you. Next slide.
I have a question real quick.
Yes, sir.
What are the proposed numbers in that slide? Do we know?
These are just targets. Director Adams, they are our targets for us to set aside the $5 million to go towards capital support funding, pension plan funding, employee benefits, that type of thing. The funding, the fiscal year 23 budget is a little over $30 million. If we are successful with the FY 24 budget, we will attempt to hold that number pretty much constant. And as we continue to bring in efficiencies by matching human resources and technology, surely that should generate some savings that will go towards funding other mandatory operating costs.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you for that question, Director Adams. Next slide. So using one-time COVID-19 relief funds strategically to shape the new normal. Again, this is just a graph that helps us to understand the COVID relief funds, what the new normal looks like, and again, how we can set aside funds that help us to help us to meet those needs that we are describing in our new normal in the master transit plan. Next slide. Using new capital funds to leverage federal grants. So we know already that there's a couple of, besides the bipartisan infrastructure law funding that we've been quite successful with over the last year. In addition to that, we've also had some THUD earmarks. Senators Ossoff, Warnock, and Congressman Carter have all been very helpful supporters to CAT. And we are always in contact with their staffs and are always getting information from them directly about how we can leverage new federal grants. We are, again, I'll reiterate, being very strategic though about what we go for because the federal funding requires a local match. And every grant isn't necessarily a grant that we need. We need for the grants to be strategic to accomplish a particular performance or program or project objective that we have. And we need to be able to have a really solid cost estimate that we go into that with, a really solid scope that we go into that with, and then the required local match ready to go as we make those applications. Next slide. Pursue additional short-term funding opportunities, and you can see state, local, and project specific what some of those ideas are. We'll discuss these in more detail at the upcoming board meeting when we have the full board present, but if you have any questions about any of these, we're glad to discuss them. Many of them are ones that you've seen us talk about in the earlier part of this presentation. Next slide. Use funds to demonstrate impact of transit funding and the need for more. So part of this to me is, especially with things like SPLOSTs, T-SPLOSTs, those kinds of things that require voter support, you're always proving yourself that you've earned it, you've earned that opportunity, and that you can deliver with quality and excellence. And that you will earn that next opportunity, because we are in the state of Georgia. We use in every jurisdiction throughout the state, SPLOST type programs, local sales tax programs are used extensively throughout Georgia. And they're always backed by or brought about by a voter referendum, which means you're always earning trust. And you're always earning a next opportunity when those things need to be reconsidered or continued in the future to support what you have ongoing. So both the this first year and the application that Ms. Cutter is working on right now for the allocation style funds from the Georgia Transit Trust Fund, we've got to make this year's count. We've got to show them that we have the trust and confidence and the capability that next year will be considered again. That'll be a new annual funding opportunity for us. Right now, it rests around I think it was about $240,000, $250,000, somewhere in that range. So not a huge amount of money, but that's again because right now we're a single county transit system. If we begin to provide some services, whether that's commuter express or otherwise beyond the boundaries of Chatham County, and we serve a multi-county jurisdiction, it'll kick us up into another category where we could be considered for additional funding there. So that's an exciting prospect if those opportunities materialize. And then on the local side, we've talked about the motel fees, the consideration potentially of a T-Spliced, the current Spliced programming that we enjoy a great partnership with the county on, and then the special transit district increase or expansion and so forth, and how that may be considered. As long as we continue to show that we are providing great service, that we are partnering in the community effectively, and that if you help support us financially, you are going to see a return on your investment, and we're going to deliver on time and on budget. That's what we have to do. Next slide.
May I make a
Yep.
comment? Can you go back to the last one? I'm very interested in the special transit district expansion as being sort of underpinning a lot of the other goals that we're trying to hit, because that's the only funding source that's also tied to limiting where we can and cannot go.
Correct.
And there just seems to be, it'll be difficult to reach some of our goals for how to help county mobility while having a Swiss cheese type model of where we can go.
Absolutely.
And that seems to be the one I'd be interested to know. I'm not necessarily asking these, but it'd be interesting to know if every municipality in Chatham County was paying into that fund, how much more would that be for us?
Or if just all of Chatham County was a special transit district.
Exactly. I'd be really interested to see what would that be, what would we be able to play with then? Because I do think there could be a case to be made, a really strong case to be made to leadership in all of those municipalities that aren't currently part of the special transit district, to encourage them to come aboard, especially in light of, this is what you're saying, is sort of like proving ourselves over and over and over again. And I think just making sure that while we're doing that, we're also maybe nudging them to join in, because it'll be, I mean, I was asked yesterday, why don't cat buses go to Tybee Island? I was like, well, that's a long story. That's all. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, and we'll get that number for you just for discussion purposes. Yeah. So, next slide. Strengthen the service even with fewer buses, using pilots to test new ideas. This microtransit pilot through the grant award that we're going to be speaking about tomorrow at the press conference will be a critical part of that, and is responsive to, I know that Director Stone has really had a strong interest in first mile, last mile connectivity, and this microtransit pilot is going to be our opportunity to really show how that works. And if you recall, I think there's a couple things about this that I think are really important to note. One, of course, the SMART grant award itself is quite noteworthy. The partnerships that we have that are a part of this, that include Georgia Tech, Savannah State, GDOT, and our ATU local professional operators, because we made a very conscious decision that, unlike some of our other transit peers around the country, that we wanted to pursue microtransit with the EV microtransit vehicles with our own operators and our own equipment, not a contract arrangement. So we're very proud of that approach. And it's something that you'll get to hear more about tomorrow, as well as GDOT being a strong partner in this with us as well, especially on that technology side. Leveraging existing partnerships and new partnerships. Partnerships are everything. You're going to hear us talk about that all the time, because that's the only way to grow CAT service, is by continuing to find other relationships. We had a great meeting, as an example, with United Way last week to talk about a partnership that they currently have with Uber and Lyft that gets people to and from jobs, and how next year we will have an opportunity to interact with them in that same business arrangement potentially. So we're working on that. We're working with the expansion of service. We mentioned municipalities here with the city of Garden City right now. And within probably the next, I would say, 45 days or so, we should have that new service expansion there up and running. Exploring various zero fare approaches and their potential impacts to ridership equity, the financial plan and service quality. Again, nothing, we are not going to suggest, as some systems around the country are considering, that we go zero fare system wide, but what we are considering is looking at, we've got zero fare in a couple of different parts of our service now, whether that is in the DOT, the CAT DOT shuttles that serve around that area, around sort of downtown Forsyth Park, but now also over to Carver Village and Cloverdale. We're very proud of expanding to those neighborhoods and up to Victory. And then, of course, with our ferries. But what we want to do is think, are there also some other places, particularly with an equity motivation and an equity performance objective, that maybe a few other very targeted zero fare approaches or strategies could make our system just grow and be even better. And then conducting a fare policy goal setting and a detailed fare policy assessment following the master transit plan. Again, it's another way to have us be able to dig more deeply into our current fare policy and figure out what should goal setting for that look like, and how does it build upon all of the financial strategies work and this overall master planning effort that we're undertaking. Next slide.
Join the meeting.
Using pilots to test new ideas without long-term financial impact, again, a good approach. It's a way to try things on for size and see if it works. And it's always okay to fail. You know, one of the, I've told that story before, is one of the best mayors that I ever worked with was one who would let you go try things and say, well, if it fails, we'll try something else, because you learned from failing. While we want to do that very prudently and judiciously, nonetheless, the notion that we can test some things and we don't have to try it wholesale. We can try it in a targeted way and see how it works, and then figure out if that works for us at a system level. Next slide. Begin with the micro.
I would like to say, I think that's very important.
It
I think
is.
it's very important.
It is. Begin with the microtransit pilot through the recently awarded grant. You're going to hear more about that tomorrow, so I won't go into a whole lot of detail on that right now. And we've already talked about it a bit. Next slide. Reinforce partnerships and develop new partnerships. We're going to talk about partnerships until you're going to go, good grief, can they talk about anything else? But I cannot tell you how important this is, and we've already demonstrated that with the work that we're doing with GDOT right now, with the transit signal prioritization project that we've got going on with both the city and with GDOT, with the strong partnerships that we have with the county and with Chatham County on all the things that we do, with the expansion of things like our ferry maintenance facility, our paratransit, our new paratransit maintenance facility, and these new services that we're considering. Partnerships are going to be everything to how we can make those things happen. And we even have some potential partnerships with some of our sister systems north of here, if we decide to do a pilot around commuter express. With some of the opportunities, for example, with the Hyundai plant, we have some opportunities there for vehicle sharing and so forth that will help us to undertake that as a pilot, again, as a test, as we talked about earlier. Next slide. Explore zero fare approaches and impacts to ridership, equity, financial, and service quality, and we've already talked about that, and we'll get into this a little bit more. We do want to, we've been very purposeful and intentional, and I'll mention this, about calling this zero fare, because zero fare is not free. There is nothing, something may be fare free, but it doesn't make it transit service free. And so we want to be sure that we're very intentionally using that term zero fare or fareless, because there are other costs that are there that we are incurring, and that we do have to figure out how we are managing that in our overall budget and financial picture. Next slide. Talked already about this, conducting a fare policy goal setting and a detailed assessment after we've completed the master transit plan, so we can look at all of these various tools, whether it's flat fare, fare capping, zero fare, time-based fares, peak and off-peak, distance-based and zone-based. A lot of different ways to look at how fare policy can be structured, and we want to be sure that we bring all those forward to the board in a subsequent effort after the master transit plan completes. Next slide. And so In terms of implementation, based upon all of this work, great plans are wonderful, but they're really only great when they get implemented. And so the master transit plan investment priorities, you can see short term in FY24 to FY26, looking at increasing those service levels, introducing the micro transit and the first mile, last mile connectivity that we can achieve through that, as well as just an expansion of service more deeply into the community, kinds of pilot programs we might consider. We also want to look at a little bit of rebranding, and I don't mean renaming CAT or redoing our logo or any of those kinds of things, but more, for example, when people talk about the DOT shuttle, they call it the DOT shuttle. They don't call it the CAT DOT shuttle. When they talk about the ferries, they call them the Savannah Bell Ferry. They don't call them the CAT Savannah Bells. And we want to be sure that those parts of our system are identified, though, as CAT parts of our system, so that the full value of CAT is recognized clearly throughout the community. Capital investments, again, short-term needs there that are a part of what we talked about earlier on in this presentation about how we let a little bit of our, what should have been our sort of state of good repair get away from us, and those investments are going to be really important. Increasing our service levels in the medium term, continued expansion of things as it's warranted and as we have the way to invest and support it financially, and then longer term, particularly longer term funding strategies, and maybe even some consideration of a regional transit system that grows beyond our current boundaries. Next slide. So the schedule to the end of the fiscal year, we are continuing with all kinds of community engagement. There's focus groups, there's public meetings, there's draft plans sharing that's going on with stakeholders and members of the public. There is an upcoming meeting that will be held here at CAT. That will be an open house for all elected officials and business and community organization leadership to see a draft of the plan and be able to comment on it, touch it, feel it, ask about it, and so forth. And then around June 27th or 28th, and we will be presenting that draft plan publicly also at the May CAT board meeting. And that'll be after all of that input has been wrapped up into it, and it has been extensive over this last nearly year. And then around June, the June board meeting, will have a final stakeholder advisory committee meeting. The final master transit plan will be presented to the board. There's also meetings with the MPO and MPC sprinkled in amongst these dates that are up here. So it's going to be a busy next 2.5 months or so leading up to the grand finish. Next slide. So thank you. You will be hearing from these individuals that have done a lot of the really strong work here at the board meeting, the full board meeting, but we appreciated the opportunity to share this with you today, as this is the strongest and most significant initiative in planning. With that, if you have any questions, we are glad to answer them.
No, thank you. I'm good.
The only thing I'd add, I do think the transit-oriented development policy side is very interesting, because it obviously there's cost to everything, but it's not necessarily a lot of money. And once it's implemented correctly, in a way, it gets people to play for us, as opposed to, and I've said this the whole time I've been on this board, is it seems that we're always catching up. It's that developers, factories, whatever, choose where to go, and sometimes it's very far away, and then are surprised when nobody can get there, and then we have to sort of try to catch up, and it's extremely expensive for us to do that. I'm trying to find some way. I think the way I put this before was to have the MPC think more as a transit agency and have CAT think more as a land use agency. It's just an interesting sort of brain experiment thinking thought to go through, because I do think the transit-oriented development side could be really effective, very efficient, and I think as I said at the last meeting, is if we're not thinking about mobility and transportation costs for the region, who is? And I really like the idea too, if I may, of rebranding and just making sure that some of our most successful products, the ferry and the dot shuttle. We just sort of miss out on every opportunity to just, and it's not like a huge deal, but it is. It's just, there's what, 40,000 rides a month on the dot shuttle, and each of those can be an opportunity to associate CAT with a product that people really like. And same with the Bell Ferry. So I'm excited to hear about that. I think that could be very useful.
We'll also have new we're also going to have new hybrid fleet coming in on marine services, new ferries coming in, right? And then it's so easy to just simply add the CAT logo to those things.
Yeah.
It's an easy, inexpensive rebrand from that fashion, but it becomes very visible. It's very, from that perspective, it's very prominent. And I think it is an important part that people understand the full value that we bring, and that some of the things that they enjoy the most in our community are things that are all about Chatham area transit, and we need their support.
Well, not just that, but things that are mobility related. I mean, people love that. Going to places is so much fun, and having, some of the products we've got, especially the dot, especially the ferry, are run very well, and we could definitely use the benefits that they bring. So I'm excited to hear about it.
Absolutely.
That's great. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you. That's all we have today, Director. Thank you very much. We do have, I will mention that you'll notice that under the financial, we like to be able to show you what's going on in other committees. In the Financial Services and Audit Compliance Committee, the FY 2024 APTA membership renewal will be brought forward for a vote, and was discussed earlier, but in the full board meeting, it will be brought up. And then the executive governance, there will be the FY 24 governance calendar will also be presented.